Early March 1943, in Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea, a weary man wiped the oil from his hands and stared at an aircraft that should not have existed. Major Thomas Reed Mackenzie stood before a B-25 Mitchell bomber transformed into something that violated every regulation in the book. Its glass nose had been stripped away, replaced with a wall of firepower, 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns where once a bombardier had knelt. This was no longer a medium bomber built for high-altitude precision strikes. This was something new, something desperate, a weapon born not from official orders, but from one man's fury and heartbreak. What Mackenzie could not have known in that moment was that his unapproved creation would go on to help deliver the single most devastating defeat to the Imperial Japanese Navy in the entire Pacific War. This story does not begin in March 1943, but 2 years earlier in December 1941, when Japanese bombers blackened the skies above Manila. Mackenzie, then 42 years old and managing the fledgling Philippine Airlines, watched in horror as the U.S. Air Forces were annihilated on the ground. His wife Catherine and their 4 children remained trapped in Manila while Japanese troops advanced. He tried to save them. He tried to get them out, but the war moved too quickly. By January 1942, his family was captured and imprisoned in the Bilibid prison camp. Something inside him broke that day. From then on, every plane he flew, every gun he mounted, every bomb he dropped was driven by a single purpose. Not just duty, but vengeance. When General William Stratton took command of the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific later that year, he found a disaster. Morale was low, equipment was failing, and Japanese convoys moved with near impunity. High-altitude bombing with B-17S was barely scratching enemy shipping. Something had to change, and that change came in the form of Mac Mackenzie. Mackenzie was no engineer on paper, but he knew planes as few men ever could. He scavenged wrecks, stripped fighters for their guns, and began modifying attack aircraft in the field. He ripped bombardier positions out of planes and welded in machine guns. He created strafer bombers that roared in at treetop height, hurling storms of lead before dropping their bombs. These aircraft were not built in factories. They were forged in makeshift hangars by a grieving father who refused to follow the rules. By early 1943, his modified B-25 Mitchells were ready for battle. They would prove themselves in the crucible of the Battle of Huon Gulf. Intelligence revealed a massive Japanese convoy moving troops and supplies to reinforce New Guinea. 8 transports, 7 destroyers, nearly 6,800 men. If those soldiers reached their destination, Allied advances could be stalled for months, maybe longer. If the convoy was destroyed, Japan would suffer a crippling blow. On March 8, 1943, the skies over Huon Gulf erupted. First came the high-altitude B-17S, forcing the Japanese ships to maneuver. Then, low and fast came Mackenzie's modified B-25S, accompanied by Australian Wirraways and American P-40 Warhawks. The B-25S screamed in at wave-top height, unleashing torrents of 50-caliber fire that swept Japanese decks clean, silencing anti-aircraft guns in seconds. Then came the bombs, released so low they skipped across the water like stones, slamming into hulls and detonating beneath the surface with catastrophic force. One by one, Japanese transports burst apart, men and equipment vanishing into the sea. Destroyers were torn open, convoys scattered, chaos erupting in every direction. In just 2 days of relentless strikes, all 8 transports and 4 destroyers were sunk. Thousands of Japanese soldiers never made it ashore. Out of nearly 6,800 troops, fewer than 1 in 50 survived to fight again. Huon Gulf had become a graveyard. For the Allies, losses were minimal, just a handful of aircraft compared to the annihilation of an entire convoy. The battle proved conclusively that air power, when wielded with innovation and daring, could strangle an enemy's supply lines, and win a campaign before the ground battle was even fought. Mackenzie's vision had been vindicated. His illegal modifications had not only worked, they had changed the course of the war in the Pacific. And yet, for Mackenzie, The war never truly ended until February 1945, when Bilibid was finally liberated and his family freed after 3 long years of captivity. They were scarred, thinner, older beyond their years, but alive. The man who had defied orders, bent steel, and rewritten air warfare finally had his family back. But Mac McKenzie was not a man who ever slowed down. He continued to fly, to innovate, to push aircraft and men beyond what seemed possible. His modified bombers destroyed hundreds of ships, crippled Japanese supply lines, and made MacArthur's island-hopping strategy possible. His fingerprints are on every victory that followed in the Southwest Pacific. This is the story of one man's personal war, a story of family, loss, vengeance, and relentless ingenuity. A man who took machines built for one purpose and turned them into something else entirely. A man whose desperate gamble in a hangar in New Guinea helped change the outcome of the Pacific War forever. This is the story of Thomas Reed McKenzie and the Battle of Huon Gulf. The transformation began in desperation. While Catherine and their children suffered behind barbed wire at Bilibid, McKenzie worked with hands that never stopped shaking. Every wrench turn was an act of defiance. Every welding spark was a promise. He would bring them home, but first he would make the enemy pay. The hangars at Port Moresby became his workshop of vengeance. Wrecked aircraft littered the airfield, casualties of failed missions and mechanical breakdowns. McKenzie walked among them like a scavenger, eyes sharp for anything useful. A P-40 with a shattered fuselage but intact wing guns. A crash bomber with hydraulic systems still functional. Every piece of salvage became raw material for his vision. He recruited mechanics who understood desperation, men who had lost friends to enemy fire and wanted to hit back harder. Together they worked through tropical heat and monsoon rains, torch flames dancing in the darkness. The B-25 Mitchell was never designed for what McKenzie had in mind. Its glass nose housed a bombardier who aimed bombs from high altitude, a role that required precision and safety. McKenzie ripped that nose away with cutting torches, sparks showering the concrete floor. Where transparency had been, he welded steel plates. Where a single man had knelt with instruments, he mounted 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. The transformation violated every engineering manual and military regulation. Official doctrine called for bombers to attack from altitude, safe from anti-aircraft fire. McKenzie's vision required pilots to fly at wave height, close enough to taste salt spray, near enough to see enemy faces before opening fire. The 8 guns created a cone of destruction that no ship's deck could survive. Each weapon fired 800 rounds per minute, creating a storm of lead that swept everything before it. Anti-aircraft crews, bridge officers, sailors scrambling for cover, all would be obliterated in the first seconds of the attack. Only then would the bombs fall, skipping across water like stones thrown by giants, slamming into holes below the waterline where armor was thinnest. General Stratton heard whispers of McKenzie's unauthorized modifications. He could have stopped them. Regulations demanded he stop them. Instead, he looked the other way, understanding that desperate times bred desperate innovations. When intelligence reported the Japanese convoy heading for New Guinea, Stratton knew the moment had arrived. 8 transports carrying 6,800 troops, escorted by 7 destroyers, steaming through waters the enemy believed safe. If that convoy reached shore, Allied advances would stall. If it sank, Japan would bleed resources it could not replace. McKenzie's crews climbed into their modified bombers with grim determination. They understood the odds. Flying at wave height meant no room for error. A single moment of hesitation, one miscalculation, and the ocean would claim them. But they also understood what victory meant. Every transport sunk was hundreds of enemy soldiers who would never fire a shot. Every destroyer destroyed was one less warship hunting Allied submarines. The formation took off in the pre-dawn darkness of March 8th, engines roaring defiance into the tropical night. McKenzie flew lead, hands steady on controls that had become extensions of his will. Behind him, dozens of modified B-25s followed in tight formation. They reached Huon Gulf as dawn broke, golden light painting the convoy in perfect silhouette. The high-altitude B-17S struck first, bombs falling from 20,000 feet, forcing Japanese ships into evasive maneuvers that broke their defensive formation. The Mackenzie Dove, the modified B-25, dropped from 5,000 feet to wave height in seconds, speed building until the airframe shook with barely controlled violence. At 50 feet above the water, traveling 280 miles per hour, he opened fire. 8 machine guns roared simultaneously, tracers drawing lines of fire across the morning sky. The lead transport's deck erupted in chaos. Anti-aircraft crews vanished in sprays of blood and metal. Bridge windows shattered. Sailors running for cover were cut down mid-stride. 3 seconds of fire, 400 rounds impacting steel and flesh. Then Mackenzie released his bombs. They skipped across the water, struck the hull below the waterline, and detonated with force that lifted the entire ship. Behind Mackenzie, the remaining modified bombers executed the same devastating attack pattern. Australian Wirraways and P-40 Warhawks strafed lifeboats and survivors, ensuring no reinforcements would reach New Guinea beaches. For 2 days, Allied aircraft hunted the scattered convoy, methodically destroying every vessel that tried to escape. When silence finally fell over Huon Gulf, the waters were choked with debris and bodies. All 8 transports had been sunk, for the 7 destroyers lay broken on the ocean floor. Of the 6,800 Japanese troops who had embarked with confidence, fewer than 140 would survive to see shore. The rest became statistics in a battle that redefined naval warfare. Mackenzie landed his battered bomber at Port Moresby with fuel tanks nearly empty and gun barrels still smoking. Ground crews counted over 200 bullet holes in the fuselage, testament to how close he had flown to enemy fire. But he had survived. His aircraft had survived, and his vision had been proven devastatingly correct. General Stratton personally shook Mackenzie's hand, understanding that unauthorized innovation had accomplished what official doctrine could not. The Battle of Huon Gulf became doctrine itself, studied in war colleges, analyzed by strategists, copied by air forces around the world. But for Mackenzie, the true victory came in February 1945 when American forces liberated Bilibid prison camp. He stood at the gates as emaciated prisoners stumbled into sunlight, searching desperately for familiar faces. Then he saw them, Catherine, gaunt but alive, holding their 4 children close. 3 years of captivity had carved hollows in their cheeks and shadows in their eyes, but they had endured. The family that war had torn apart was finally whole again. Mackenzie held them without words, knowing that every ship he had sunk, every enemy soldier denied reinforcement, every rule he had broken had been for this moment. His illegal modifications had helped win the Pacific War, but bringing his family home, that was the only victory that truly mattered.